our volunteers. Oops, our 4-H volunteers make a difference in our program, and we know that those of you that work with volunteers truly have seen those impacts. And so hopefully we can give you some ideas of ways that you can measure and really gather that information to share with decision makers. So we wanted to just say thank you quickly to our sponsors for NACDEP. And I want to introduce myself. I apologize. My name is Rochelle Vettern, and I'm the Leadership and Volunteer Development Specialist for NDSU Extension, and I'm a professor on campus too. And I have some other co-presenters that I would like to have them share too who they are and what they do.
I'm Candy O'Neill. I'm the New Colleague Onboarding Director, University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension, and also the Volunteer Leadership Specialist.
Hi, I'm Becky Harrington with the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Youth Development, and I am currently serving as our Director of Operations and Systems.
And I'm Tilly Good. I work at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and I serve as the Stakeholders and Partnership Development Manager for Iowa 4-H Youth Development.
Thank you. Yes, and so sorry, Candy, if we can go back to those slides. We do want to thank our sponsors for NACDEP. We wouldn't be able to have this conference without them, so we truly appreciate all those different universities and entities that are helping support us. So our goals quickly today are to cover, as I mentioned, that research design. We use both quantitative and qualitative, and Becky's going to share a little bit more related to that with us in a few minutes here. We want to discuss the results of the individual, organizational, and public value of our volunteers out there across our system. We want to explore those implications and really have you apply our recommendations to your work with volunteers. So we wanted to also just acknowledge the rest of our research team. We were very fortunate. We work together a lot in the North Central region and partner on many projects, and this was one of those fun ones we enjoyed working together. Our lead in the research department was Sam Grant, who's the evaluation director at the University of Minnesota Extension. And then we also had Christian Schmieder and Josset Ghali from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who helped us and provided some expertise related to the qualitative data and training us in some of those different techniques. So before we totally dig into our information, we wanted to find out a little bit where you're from so we can kind of speak to and see who's joining us today from across the country. So if you take a minute, and I know some of you are traveling, but if you would like to do the view options, and up at the top of your screen, I know many of you have been using Zoom, so are pros at this. We'd like to have you choose annotate. And then we'd like you to stamp or mark, if you could choose that stamp selection, and whatever, if you want an arrow or a star or heart, let us know where you're coming from. Tell us where you're located, and just take a minute to select annotate, and then select stamp once you do that, and then put a stamp where you're from, or where you're located right now. Or some of you, that stamp might be moving across the country. Great, so I can see we have someone from Montana and Nebraska. Wonderful. Looks like we have a good mix.
To that from a mobile device from Indiana.
Oh, great, Maya. Oh, we have North Carolina. Yes, Montana. Wonderful. I know, and some of you might not be able to do this with your technology if you're traveling, but thanks to those of you who were able to do that. So we get a chance to hear from you and kind of what you're doing with your work with volunteers. So thank you. Our next piece is we would just like to quickly also know, since this conference is a mix of individuals from across the country, what your affiliation is, where you come from, or what your main level of work is, what content area it is. So Candy is going to pull up a poll for us quickly, and you'll be able to select kind of where you do the major portion of your work. And so again, you can click and choose what that, what your field that you work in is, so that we can kind of see where you do, if it's community economic development and leadership, ag and natural resources, some field of family and consumer sciences. If you just go ahead and take that poll.
Is everybody seeing the poll okay? Let's see, we have 2 of 6. See another minute.
Oh, great. We have someone in community, couple in family and consumer sciences. Excellent. And that encompasses so many different areas. Wait just a couple seconds here. Well, it's great to see that mix of program areas. We appreciate those of you who are able to respond to that. I know, again, if you're joining us remotely, sometimes that gets challenging. Thanks, Candy, for pulling up that poll. So as we think about this, we interact and work with volunteers from many different areas. So hopefully this research, or thinking about how you might capture this, will really help inform your work in your different program areas. Thanks for participating in that one. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Becky, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about the research and our goals for that.
Great, thank you, Rochelle. And again, welcome to everyone. And we're glad to have someone here from Washington State University. I saw that posted in the chat, and there's multiple ways to connect and to work around our technology and our connectivity. So to get us started this morning, we want to spend a few minutes providing some background about the study by looking at the research design. So when our research team began our work, we really wanted to do 3 things. We wanted to document what individuals feel they gain from their experience as a 4-H volunteer. We wanted to investigate the organizational benefits the 4-H program gains from volunteers, and we wanted to assess the volunteers' beliefs about the public value of volunteering with the 4-H program. So when we took a look at those 3 initial goals, that led us to our research goal around documenting and quantifying the impact of volunteers that they have on the 4-H youth development program. Next slide, Candy.
Yep. Sorry.
No. So when we took a look at the distribution of our survey, the research was conducted through an electronic survey using Qualtrics, and it was disseminated by the University of Minnesota and my colleague Sam Grant in the Extension Center for Youth Development. And we did a random sample of 1,000 adult volunteers from each of the 12 states in the North Central region. And using that, we wanted to collect both qualitative and quantitative data. And in sum then, we really worked to oversample diverse volunteers, both in terms of race or ethnicity. And so most states did not have more than 100 volunteers. And so again, we really tried to oversample so that we could get a representation of ethnically and racially diverse volunteers. Overall, we had a response rate of 25%, which we were thrilled at. We know that it's often not that high when it's an electronic survey that's not connected with a specific learning experience. So again, we're thrilled to have that response rate. And the Cronbach's alpha was 0.95, looking at the scaled items. So we are not competitive in the North Central region, but when we look at the next graph, we did want to be able to track where each state was at in terms of the response rate. And so you can see We had anywhere from Kansas leading the way at 310 volunteers, so having a 31% response rate, to Nebraska at 208 volunteers. And again, we're thrilled to have this kind of response rate for our survey. And so to give you a snapshot of the volunteers, over half in the study were Gen Xers, and looking at that, and there was a range in the length of service that they had. And so we had volunteers that had been with us only a year to some that had been with us several years, over 20 years. Also, 89% were white and non-Hispanic, and reported that. And a majority were part of 4-H as a child. So I don't think any of those really surprised us. We were not able to get gender. We did not pull that from the 4-H online data file. So when the survey was sent, it was sent to connect with 4-H Online, which is our data management system in 4-H. And so we did not pull that from the online data when we were surveying that. So, as I said earlier, we did take a look at, Candy, thank you for advancing, take a look at both quantitative and qualitative, because we thought it was important to hear the voices of volunteers in both of those ways through the data. So our team analyzed the quantitative data using frequency analysis, and we had a significant amount of qualitative data. So we chose to participate in a data jam process that was led by our colleagues at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in their Division of Extension. So in choosing to use a data jam process, we were really able to manage our biases as we took a look at the qualitative data, as well as make sure that it was methodologically robust. So our team actually spent a few days together sifting through a significant amount of the data at one time, and then throughout the rest of last summer. And as we did that, we selected an anchor question that guided our analysis. And you can see on the screen that anchor question was, as a result of being an extension volunteer, how are communities impacted? So we used that and had that in front of us as we generated and defined an initial set of codes. So as we would take a look at each of the questions and each of the sets of qualitative data, we established this pattern where we would code a question, reflect on that data, identify potential new codes, and then write initial findings related to the theme. So we had this rhythm as we were looking throughout the data. And then as we pulled all of that together, and yep, Candy, you can go to the next slide there, that when we looked at all of our data, we found that there are certainly volunteer benefits and benefits to young people. As a result of 4-H volunteers, we learned that extension benefits, our organization has great benefits from 4-H volunteers, and finally that our communities as a whole benefit because of the important work that 4-H volunteers are doing. So next we're going to touch briefly on the volunteer and organizational benefits, and then we'll spend the majority of time with the public value benefits.
Good morning. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the personal benefits the volunteers identified. And to get us started, we're going to use the annotated feature again. So this time we'll use the text function. So at the top of your page, you should be able to click View Options and then select Annotate. You should be able to click the capital T for the text. You can click anywhere on the screen to start a text box. You can move that box later if it's not visible to somebody because somebody else is typing in the same location. If you're not able to use the annotate, you can also use the chat box function that some of us have been using along the way. So to answer the question that you see on the screen, think of yourself as the volunteer. Think about your own experience as a volunteer. Use the annotate feature, annotate text feature to share one way you have benefited from volunteering. For me, I would maybe share that I broadened my network of personal and professional contacts. So you want to go ahead and take a minute to share how you personally have benefited from volunteering.
So again, that's on the top of your screen, and you'll be able to click on that box and
Yep.
it'll pull down and see annotate.
There's some coming in already. So we have some satisfaction of helping others, travel, which is a great benefit. I know we were all looking forward to being in New Hampshire. New friends, learn new skills. The chat box made personal professional connections with community members. Social, the interaction with other people. Those are some really great ideas and examples. I think you're going to see some of those pop up in the next couple of slides that we talk about. So if you have any others that you want to share, feel free to use the chat box as we move on to the next slide. So we asked the volunteers to respond to a similar question in regards to what they felt they personally gained through their volunteer experience. They resoundingly shared that they had fun. That means 95% enjoyed their volunteer experience, which is great to hear as a volunteer manager. You know, they're really identifying and connecting with that position, which is great. Some other statistics that are up there, 92% also said they built new relationships. In this case, we specifically asked about their relationships with youth, but built relationships is important across all program areas and speaks to the connections that are formed through this experience. 86% responded they gained skills that were useful in other settings. 75% increased their problem-solving skills. 75% increased their ability to lead meetings, and 72% became better at speaking in front of others. The volunteers were able to transfer these leadership skills to other environments. They also gained skills in teaching, leadership, and communication. A few others that I want to note is that 76 or 79% increased their competence as a leader, 76% learned how to think from diverse perspectives, and 75% built skills to manage difficult situations. So all things that they said they were able to personally gain. So these are all benefits that can help us tell the story of our current volunteers while also using the information to recruit future volunteers. In our next couple of slides, I just wanted to share some specific examples of things our volunteers actually said. So volunteers were able to tell us in their own words how they personally then benefited. I think it's important to hear from their perspective what they gained. So this volunteer from Indiana shares how they were able to have an impact on youth. They share impacting these experience and assisting them with preparation for the future. I genuinely enjoyed just having the opportunity to meet these young individuals. On the next one, this is a quote from a Minnesota volunteer that speaks to the personal benefit of increasing their confidence as a leader. You know, they were able to apply for a management position at work through this experience. And then finally, we have this volunteer from Iowa. And they were able to articulate the skill transfer that they're able to gain by volunteering. Personally, getting involved as a 4-H leader has strengthened my ability. So again, those are just a few snapshots of the things we were able to capture from the personal benefit that the volunteers gain. And next, we will move on to the organizational benefits with Rochelle.
Thanks, Tilly. We've all known throughout the years that those volunteers, that we benefit from them, but they also benefit from being involved. So it was wonderful to hear those pieces. So we do know as an organization that we have in Extension so many wonderful volunteers, and we benefit from their contributions across the country. And we wanted to be able to capture that in our research. So I want you to think about your own Extension programs just for a minute and how you interact, whether it's in a community program or in family and consumer science, family and community wellness. And again, as Tilly mentioned when you did with the individual benefits, we would like you to post at least one of the extension benefits that our organization receives from volunteers. So again, click that annotate button, click up in the text section, and then if you would be willing to post on that slide again, or if the chat box works better for you, go ahead and do that. I know with our 4-H youth development volunteers, we benefit so much. We could not run the 4-H program without them. But when I've worked in community leadership programs, because half of my position is in that area, there's so much that our leaders have done in our extension programs that we wouldn't be able to do ourselves. So we're getting some great responses already. Volunteers help Extension reach more citizens with our programming. Absolutely, they totally extend our reach and really get to that public value piece. A variety of skills and leadership of volunteers, wonderful. Made personal and professional connections with community members, and I've gained leadership positions. Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing those. Setting up and managing events. Yes, we cannot be all places at once, so having those extension volunteers assist us is absolutely crucial. And again, we wanted to hear from our volunteers how they felt like they contributed to our organizations across the North Central region. Wonderful, thank you. All right, I think Candy will move on. So we wanted to really capture both the quantitative and qualitative pieces of that related to those extension benefits. And so our organization, as you know, and I'm sure many of you have used the independent sector website to really figure out the worth of our volunteers related to the time that they donate to us. So on an average, our volunteers across the North Central region give 9 hours a month to the 4-H Youth Development Program, and that's worth about $2,600 a year. That time was divided both with working directly with our youth in the 4-H program and communities across the region, but also about 41% of planning for those activities and those positive youth development experiences with our youth. A well-planned program means a great experience for our youth. So we also had captured really some of those stats related to the organizational benefits. 85% of our volunteers are out there making community connections related to 4-H. Many of our volunteers speak in whether it's to decision makers or to different youth organizations about the value of the 4-H program. They are our best voices as far as recruiting new youth to 4-H. We like to talk about our program, but it's even better if one of those wonderful volunteers can help recruit new youth and new volunteers. We also, as you can see in some of these pictures, we have volunteers out there teaching for us. We have one of our volunteers there is doing some 4-H volunteer training. They can help engage and articulate and help teach the best effective practices to working with youth and do a wonderful job at that. So we've gained some really good quantitative stats related to that, or pieces. And Candy, I'll have you move on to the next slide. We also captured those qualitative benefits, as Tilly mentioned before too. And so as you can see with this one, they told us they write letters to our state and federal elected officials, thanking them and asking them for supporting 4-H youth development and extension as a whole. We heard those consistent themes with the qualitative content. And Candy, I'll have you advance again too. We also heard that they really do recruit new volunteers. So we talked about youth, but also volunteers. They've asked for donations on behalf of 4-H to extend our reach and do new community programs and projects. They partnered with others in our community, maybe it's with its Boys and Girls Clubs, other elected officials, individuals to make community projects successful. And this is the one I think a lot of you would be curious to know about. They said they have also volunteered or for other extension programs. And I think that's one of the key values that our volunteers tell us, is that those extension programs are crucial. We also heard that they have, and that was that last one, 57% have volunteered for other extension programs. Finally, we know that they donate supplies and money to our program. Those definitely could not all come from our local extension offices. So they've helped support that to make projects possible in communities. And then on the next slide, we really talk about, and as Becky mentioned earlier, that they not only help and contribute, but also mobilize our youth to help them serve our communities, to really teach decision-making skills, to help build those youth leadership skills, and really get those youth ready for future careers. And that's all thanks to those wonderful volunteers out there. And then we had just one more qualitative quote we wanted to share from one of our Ohio volunteers who told us that really extension benefits because our members are using their 4-H leadership and presentation skills as they apply and interview for college scholarships, college teaching assistant positions, job interviews, high school and 4-H leadership positions. So they're building skills that not only help our organization in the 4-H program, but also help out there as they become leaders in our communities. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to Candy to get to the part related to public value and building those smaller communities. Thanks, Candy, for being our techie and advancing those slides for us.
Oh, thanks, Rochelle. And I'm getting a little close to the forward bar, so moving things a little quicker sometimes. It is great to have each of you that could join us today to really dig into this public value piece. And as we think about, so we heard as Becky and Tilly and Rochelle shared, really the personal and the organizational benefits lay the foundation for where we're going with the public value pieces. And so to get started, we wanted to just do a quick poll. And so potentially, and hopefully on your screen, you have the quick reactions. Zoom have added that feature. So if you want to use your quick reaction feature at the bottom where they have a thumbs up, we're curious if how many of you have evaluated the public value of volunteers and what they bring to the programs that you work with. So if you don't mind using that reaction feature at the bottom and just show a thumbs up if you're currently doing that. If you're not a problem. That's why we're here today to talk about it. But we wanted to see if in fact has anybody evaluated. And if you don't have the quick reaction feature, you can type it in the chat box. So has anybody, or open up your mics and tell us, has anybody measured the public value of volunteers? Just curious. I'm not seeing any quick reactions or any comments. Anybody done any measurements of that? Okay, well, good to know. And if you had, we wanted to also build on that and recognize that. So what we're going to do, we're going to annotate again. I'm going to invite you also to look at the chat box, but we want you to think about, as we're starting this Stronger Communities, what is one way that you've seen volunteers make communities stronger? So specifically think about a time when either you've worked with volunteers and you've seen the impact beyond the organization that you represent and the work you're doing, that as a result, they've made the community that you live and work and play in stronger. So I invite you to think about that, annotate that, type in the chat box, and open your mics. We're going to want to talk about it for just a minute. So how have you seen volunteers that you work with make communities stronger? And we're digging into this specifically because it's that application piece beyond their personal skills and what they bring to the organization. So Ellen shared in the chat, volunteers led an effort to feed children through Backpacks to Kids program, decrease food insecurity. Awesome to see that is going to directly relate to one of the benefits that we found through the research, and are going to invite you later to think about how do we measure that. Yeah, thanks. Ellen, can you just share just a bit about that? I'd just like to get a little context.
Yeah, sure, I'd be glad to do that. I was the 4-H agent in a town in North Carolina for 20 years, and we started to see that there were a lot of children. I got teachers who were emailing and asking if there anything that we could do. Children were not eating. They were coming to school with their tummies rumbling, and they're not doing well in school because they can't pay attention. So it was really the original plan just to do this for a state level project that Harriet Edwards had led. And it turned into something that is still ongoing. I've been in my new position here for 4 years, and that program is still going strong. So we were able to feed children. Volunteers actually solicited funds, started an online payment program where people could give money to that program. And then we work with the food banks to have pre-packaged meals that could be delivered to the children. So we were able to reach a huge number of children and get them fed, and
Wow.
a huge impact from that.
That's awesome. Definitely public value. So that's exciting to, how to measure and document that impact. Thank you. And I see volunteers are more aware of their communities and usually volunteer in many areas, not just extension. Exactly. That is another specific area that's cited. Anybody else have examples they want to annotate and put up there, or just open your mic and share?
Candy, there's another example in the chat.
Oh, thanks. Maya, awesome. I helped organize a recycling program at Ross Aid Stadium at Purdue. During games, we educated visitors on how to recycle and where to recycle in the building. Awesome. Thank you. Another great example. I am going to just clear these drawings here, going back between the screens here. So that, appreciate hearing the voices as well as kind of getting in the space. Oh, thanks. We've got another one. Extensions serve on other organizations. Excellent. Yeah, I'm going to save that one too here. The one thing, I'm sure all of you have had the same experience when you're annotating, got to save, got to clear. So all of that takes just a minute. So appreciate that. Oh, and then you go someplace else.
Thanks, Candy, for being our techie. We appreciate it. And Ellen, we love Harriet. We work with her a lot in the world of volunteer development with 4-H youth development, and in North Dakota while Candy's doing that, we are working on expanding our backpack program. So I will be contacting you about new ideas. That's great.
Well, I'm not actually in charge of the program anymore. Like I said, I was the 4-H agent for 20 years, and then I took the job as county extension director in another county. But I'd be glad to talk with you about it. Absolutely. Wouldn't mind that at all.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
And that's what this space is all about. Even though we're not there physically, it is making those connections. So we want this to be your room to share and really a community. So just to frame public value a little bit before we jump into the results, just a little bit of the research and the scholarship behind it. Probably not necessarily new to you, and we just want a common framework. So just a couple pieces. We're going to start with Moore. So Moore really had done a lot of research around the value an organization contributes to the society, and specifically raised this back in the early 1995. That work started, he was a Harvard University professor, still is, and he encouraged public value outcomes by defining how a program contributes to the good of a society. And really at that time it was around government agencies and organizations. How do you really help the public in the communities where you live know the value beyond just being a public works department? So that's where it started. As we were doing the research around this and studying it, a name that was familiar to a lot of us was Dr. Laura Kalambokidis out of University of Minnesota. And for extension, in her particular role, she's an applied economist there, but she really initiated the public value movement in extension. And one of the framings that she put forth was the value of a program to those who do not directly benefit. How do we think about the skills that people have gained personally, what we say they're doing to the organization, but then how do we transfer that into public value? And so she led a series of workshops in late 2000s. I know I attended one in, I think it was 2008, just really challenging educators to think about that. Then I would say, I think we're all more closely, at least in 4-H youth development, connected with Dr. Nancy Franz, who has done a lot of work and challenged extension to move from embracing personal value to really translating that value of extension work into public value statements. And really thinking about storytelling. Nancy talks a lot about storytelling and how do we use what people are telling us to really convey that so it resonates with stakeholders. And most recently, she's retired, she's from Ohio, but she has done work across the country and continues to present on extensions work around public value and helping individuals. I know she worked specifically with us, and she's also worked with other states to think about this public value. So when we, as we thought about this research, and we connected with Nancy, and actually was a informal consultant for us, and really talked about, as a research team, we wanted to know, how do we document those public value statements related to extension, specifically things that you identified earlier. So what we did is we connected with her to learn about the measurements of public value, things that she had done and research around that. And she encouraged us to anchor, and at the beginning you heard Becky talk about the anchor question, to anchor our public value to a finite number of outcomes. So they were these 4 outcomes: stronger communities, better connected communities, improved health of communities, and increased civic involvement. So these were the 4 that as a research team we agreed to really focus on. So open up your mics again, or use the stamp feature. What we were hoping you would do is, with the stamp feature, is just use that stamp under annotate to make a mark with your stamp, any of those 4, it could be 1 or more, and put a stamp in the box where you, as a role as an educator or in your administration role, that you believe volunteers have either made stronger communities, better connected communities, improved health of communities, or increased that civic involvement. So again, if you can use your stamp feature, we just want to get a sense of what you believe is going on as a result of volunteers that you work with. And I see some coming in already. It's great. I'm going to go back here and just try and capture that. So we have makes communities stronger, better, a couple under improved health involvement, improved health of communities, increased civic involvement. Awesome. I'm going to just save that and clear that. And we've just, oh, I'll clear that too. We have a quote there: personally, and this is from Iowa, I have become more vocal and involved in community decisions since becoming a 4-H volunteer. It's showing me that our opinions do matter, and we need to take action on those opinions we feel strongly about. And I've shared my thoughts on a local school board option that before I would have kept to myself. So powerful. So again, thinking about these 4 areas. I'm just gonna move that. There we go. Here. In this particular public value, what we found is 92% of the volunteers said it makes communities stronger. 89% contributes to better connected communities. 81% improves the health of communities, and 78% increases that civic involvement. So in these particular open-ended responses, and there were thousands of responses that we reviewed and used the data jam process to quantify. In particular, just we want to just dig into a little bit, what did it look like? You know, what were the specific things that came up? So as far as making communities stronger, communities are stronger because of extension volunteers. They connect by what was identified: building relationships, improving the health, increasing civic involvement. And specifically with Stronger, they targeted fundraising opportunities. They worked with community stakeholders to secure that extension funding. And they collaborated with local organizations to raise funds for community needs, such as women's shelters. Also building little lending libraries, supporting veterans and military families, and collecting supplies for animal shelters. So those are specific ways that volunteers documented, and it was exciting to see all the qualitative responses come through. This particular example is about writing a grant for fairgrounds improvement. So that was the first area. The second was better connected communities. So as we dug into that, volunteers also cited specific examples, and in fact, over 1,000 volunteers wrote over 1,000 specific examples on how communities were better connected in these open-ended responses. And the key themes that were coming out there was education of stakeholders and community members that they were providing, And a Michigan volunteer talks about starting to go to township meetings to find out what's going on as a result. So by being engaged in the organization, by gaining those personal skills, they then were transferring that to public value and being more engaged in their community, which we just found so powerful and exciting, and something that we knew, right? We inherently knew, but this was the first chance that we've seen really an opportunity to document how are volunteers making a difference, where they work, live, and play beyond extension, and to really quantify that. And there's a quote from a Kansas volunteer there as well, where business owners reach out. What we did not learn is participants did not indicate what happened because of those built relationships. So digging deeper into that. They were asked to share examples, so we coded and put those together in themes. But as far as digging deeper, like with a focus group on, well, tell us more, that's an opportunity for future research. The third area was really improved health of communities, which came up in your example, Ellen. So volunteers coordinated food drives that directly benefit the community. Key themes that we found in this coding related to physical fitness, mindfulness, and nutrition, with a focus not only on behaviors or knowledge, but also behavior change. So as we think about that improved health of communities. And then finally, increased civic involvement, which you also annotated and talked a little bit about. We defined this as engagement in organizational or community decision-making and or voicing opinions to civic leaders. So here, volunteers were identified stepping up to leadership roles where they were advocating for change in the community, to elected officials, huge, you know, where a person has gained those skills. And you probably can think yourself where somebody says, I would have never done this before if I wouldn't have this experience with extension, with being on, whether it's 4-H or your own role that you've worked with. So this was a chance to really document that. And a North Dakota volunteer specifically talked about how they secured additional support. They felt comfortable to lobby the county commission to secure funding for a position that wasn't there, to create that position. So what's exciting is really to see volunteers evolve as leaders. And I'm sure you can think yourself, like, you know, the person maybe you started with that was rather hesitant in how you coached and moved them into other roles. And volunteers encourage that local change. So an Indiana volunteer specifically talked about how they were seeking out positions themselves on boards because they felt that confidence. Here's a diagram that we used when we did the data jam, and Christian helped as we were talking, and the ideas were coalescing around themes and we were refining. It really shows how the leveraged relationships and the awareness relates to activating financial resources. They're all interconnected, which then moves into building capital and educating partnerships. So the arrows go back and forth, and it's just, I think, an easy way that captures that. I'm just going to pause. Any thoughts or questions on that before we jump to the next piece? So here the 4 of them are then: leveraging relationships, service contributions, leadership and civic engagement, and raising awareness. Just 4 key areas that were identified around that qualitative data. And knowing that volunteers have a significant role with those partnerships, speaking on behalf of Extension, volunteers assume community leadership roles to contribute civically beyond that. And we talked about this North Dakota volunteer who really felt so comfortable that going to county commissioners repeatedly, not just once, but repeatedly, in order to promote and encourage support youth for their families. And we did find there was a difference between volunteers taking a leadership role in civic engagement and completing civic service. So again, volunteering as a service thing, different than actually being engaged and speaking on behalf of. So that's notable, which really leads to our first recommendation. So 6 things that we're going to invite you to think about, and then just in a few minutes, we're going to go into some breakout rooms. So as we go through these 6 recommendations, just want you to think about each of these, and then you'll get a chance to talk with your colleagues. So the first recommendation is assess if the individuals trained and supported in volunteer roles are becoming more engaged in other organizations and communities. So here's an opportunity for us as professionals to be intentional and assess that. In our research, we found volunteers named specific skills that they were developing. Becky talked a little bit about that, as well as Tilly: planning, organizing, guiding, mentoring, teaching. There's an opportunity also for us as leaders or other organizational leaders to measure that impact and think about what are we providing volunteers to equip them. And then these skills, that as they develop these skills, how do they relate to the readiness for volunteers to assume roles? So really, how can you assess? The second recommendation is really to think about and then utilize a leadership framework to develop competencies in volunteers and professionals. And I'll just mention here, as we think about the framework, our findings found that supporting, utilizing a consistent framework to develop those competencies really creates an opportunity for our organization to assess that impact. So they're really interconnected. We're assessing, we also want to utilize that framework. And an example we want to share, we happen to be doing another research study at the same time, and it was interesting because they really supported each other. We have a course in the North Central region, Achieving the Extension Mission Through Volunteers, and you'll hear a little bit about it later, but a piece of that course for equipping professionals focuses around the Isature model, which some of you may be familiar with. If not, originally developed by Robert Dolan out of North Carolina, professor there. But then in 1971, Milton Boyce introduced it as a strategy for managing volunteers. And it focuses on identifying, selecting, orienting, training, utilizing, recognizing, and evaluating. That framework for competencies for working with volunteers is key. And there's correlations that come up there that if we're intentional about that framework, it really prepares volunteers. It prepares our staff to work with volunteers and our volunteers to be more successful. So our recommendation is to utilize that framework to really develop those competencies and be intentional. The third is to share public value messages with elected officials. That is an area that is near and dear to me, that volunteers can say the message better than I can as a person working in extension. So how do we share those public value messages with elected officials to leverage that support? How can volunteers be equipped and have that confidence? So that public value piece, to think about that. And we confirm through both the qualitative and quantitative that volunteers join and contribute to those civic organizations. So how do we share that leaders know that, and volunteers can say, you know, I'm serving on this board as a result of the skills gained. And then engage those volunteers to develop that public value message and what that looks like. Then the last two, provide tools, provide extension professionals with tools to report that public value. I think that's a big gap that we found collectively of how volunteers' efforts result in that intentional effort from staff using that framework. So what can we build into recording results or reporting systems that really documents and gathers that data? So that we can really capture that. What assessment tools can we be using to measure that contribution, and that professionals have that easily to record and tell a larger story. And then the last, we invite each of you, and as you work with others, going back to the 4 public value outcomes of better connected communities, civic engagement, leadership, improved health and well-being, and making communities stronger. How can we take those categories and put those into a reporting system to report against that, so as a whole, across program areas, we can tell that story? Because it's happening in community development, it's happening in family living, it's happening in natural resources. Not only youth, we know that. Volunteers cut across all the institutes or program areas. So how do we tell that larger extension story? So with that, we're going to do some work.
Oh, sorry,
No,
go ahead.
No.
So we wanted to hear from you. As Candy mentioned, we are going to do some work. We've talked, and now we want to hear or have you work in some smaller groups, as mentioned before, to really discuss the implications of our research related to that individual benefit of that volunteers get out of volunteering, organizationally how we benefit, and in our communities with that public value piece. And so we're going to break you into smaller rooms, and then as you work in your smaller groups, if you're able to use either through the chat or through hopefully you can open up your mics and talk with each other and just select one of those levels, so whether it's individual, organizational, or community, and talk about this and how this applies to your future work with volunteers. Again, and how what we shared might impact your future work. Maybe you'll think about gathering impacts a little differently. Maybe you'll really capture that public value and share it with some of your decision makers. So again, Candy's going to break you into those groups, and then we'll call you back in about 7 minutes to be able, 7 to 10 minutes to be able to share some of those ways that you might use this research as you move forward working with volunteers. Candy, did you want to add anything?
Yep. So we did two. I have 2 rooms set up, and then and so hopefully the way it's set up is you'll be invited to the breakout room if you haven't had a chance to do that. So you'll see a little invitation. You just click on that and you go into that. You can do that both remotely or so if you're traveling, that should work as well. If not, just you can come back to the space and we'll get you moved into a room. If you haven't been in a breakout room, you know, you're not held captive, you can leave it at any time, but we'll do a broadcast message at about 5 minutes and then we'll let you know like a minute before it's ready to wrap up. Once you get that final, like the rooms are going to close, you still have 60 seconds. So don't think you have to leave right at that time. You have 60 seconds to do that. And then again, this worksheet is in your Google folder as well. So if you want to pull it up, we do want you to report back out. So if somebody can be taking notes and be thinking about that, and we want to hear your ideas on what it looks like. So other additions, Becky, Tilly, Rochelle? There's 3 of you in a room. I'll open it up. And Becky, Rachel, Rochelle, and Tilly, we were in the last room, so don't worry about that one. Don't go. So you should have got an invitation to join. So I'll invite you if you can accept that. I'm going to stop sharing. And let's see. Just checking here. Does everybody see their invitation? Looks like Ellen has left and Maya. Tiffany, Christine, okay. Tiffany, are you seeing the invite?
Hello.
You're back. Oh. So welcome back. Are all of our group members back, Candy, or we're still waiting for a couple of them?
I think everybody is back out of the room.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us and being able to leave and have a little conversation with others and then come back. So we would love now just to hear, I think all of you ended up over in one group. We'd like to hear a little bit about what you talked about, either about the individual, organizational, or community impacts of volunteers and any or all of those. So did you pick someone who'd kind of share out for the rest of your group?
Well, yeah, for ours. So Ellen had a really great point about being able to utilize this for tangible benefits to do volunteer recruitment. And then my point was, I've always wanted to do this, but I haven't really had an idea of what questions to ask or how to ask them, because in my position, I am always battling with the county commissioners, because Master Gardener program is non-essential. And so being able to sell what we do, I think is really important too.
It's interesting, when you talk about the recruitment, we actually redid volunteer position descriptions in Wisconsin using the benefits gained into those position descriptions and cited what volunteers, what they named as a benefit, not what I might think, but what they specifically said.
Oh, that's cool. Mm-hmm.
You know, and being able to capture that, that's one thing that we will mention too, that we had a conversation as partners now that we've published our research, that we are willing to share our instrument or our tools. So we, our evaluator wanted to, Sam Grant wanted to be the main contact for that. So if you email one of us, we'll get you connected with Sam if you want that instrument to be able to collect that data. And I think now master gardeners are vital. They always have been, but even more now than ever with people planting victory gardens and everything. It is going to be crucial. And to be able to take this data and share, our extension agents, the ones that have, many of them have taken this back, our North Dakota results, back to their advisory councils, their county commissioners, their decision makers, and really said, here's the impacts we're having with our 4-H volunteers. We have to be here as an office in order to be able to say, hey, you know, we mobilize these volunteers. So extension has a value, and then it leads to larger values with that outreach of those 4-H volunteers. Those master gardeners are helping our youth, our families, the health piece. We've heard that over and over again, as Candy mentioned that, with our qualitative comments related to the health, whether it was those gardens, those community gardens, or 5Ks, or donating to food pantries. All of those are huge pieces that we in Extension help mobilize those volunteers to be able to do that. So what else did you talk about?
That was pretty much it. We were just talking about the selling, but then also the recruitment of the fact that volunteers are a changing face now. So even looking at the Master Gardener program, what I was reflecting to them is my older Master Gardeners, I'll be like, let's weed the demonstration garden. And they're like, that's awesome. And my younger Master Gardeners are like, why? Like, you have to explain it to them. You have to say, okay, so a well-looked demonstration garden draws in people. People trust us because it looks like it's taken care of. We know what we're doing. We can teach a workshop there and keep our professional look. And so also remembering all those benefits, because the younger face of the volunteers, they want that. They want to know that if I weed, it's not weeding. It's impacting my community. It's resulting in, and the older volunteers are just like, whatever, we weeded.
See, if I had that frame around weeding, now I will go in and weed. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So Rochelle, I talked just a minute about it. I wondered how the results from this might have been skewed somewhat had we included lots of the Master Gardener volunteers in the survey. And maybe you did. Did you do that?
These were just 4-H youth development volunteers. At the very beginning of our conversation, we had talked about doing all of Extension, because some of our volunteer development specialists manage all of Extension too in their states. And so there was that conversation, but trying to figure out how we would access all those populations when, for the most part, we are 4-H youth development specialists. We knew we could get to our 4-H online group, as Becky talked about, but that's why we're challenging you. And actually, that's what our next slide said. We're hoping that you will access those other parts of Extension that we just didn't feel like it began to become this gigantic study. And we said, you know, we're willing now to share this tool so that those of you that work in other areas of Extension and communities and family, in the family area, in ag and natural resources, including those master gardeners, can really do this research too, because we'd love to be able to combine it. So we really want to call for those NACDEP members out there to replicate this study, so that we can offer a national picture of public value with our Extension volunteers, and really elevate the importance of investing in Extension in our volunteer programs. Because as we look at resources and we look at the way that Extension is moving, it is more important now than ever to have our Extension professionals really be able to be excellent volunteer developers and managers, really to be knowledgeable in volunteer systems. And we are willing to help you with capturing those things so that, like you mentioned, that your group discussed, that you can go back to those decision makers and really say, hey, here's what kind of impacts we're having in communities. Here's the public value of these volunteers. So with that, Becky's going to talk just quickly a little bit about those skills or some ways that you can build those.
As Candy alluded to earlier, we have a course, and we were working on kind of 2 different impact studies at the same time, which that's a whole nother discussion to think about the wisdom or lack of wisdom in doing 2 studies that are closely connected at the same time. But that was exciting in that what we learned from this, and we know that one of the recommendations is how do we develop our professionals, our extension professionals, to work more effectively with volunteers and to lead those volunteer systems because of the great impacts that 4-H volunteers have. And so, and Candy, I see people are still needing to request permission to access the Google Doc. So we'll get that figured out, maybe at the very least be able to get people's email addresses that we can send that information to you. But we do, in the North Central region, a few years ago, developed the Achieving the Extension Mission Through Volunteers, and it is an online cohort course. We offer it at the end of January, and it runs for 6 to 7 weeks, and it is designed for extension professionals from all program areas. And so we've really made an effort to not make it too 4-H-y. We have examples from multiple extension programs, as I'd said. But again, really seeing a need to develop skills in our colleagues to work with volunteer systems. So we did an impact and a report, and I think I can put that, give you the link to that. Nope, I did that again. We have an impact report for the course.
Sorry, I was trying to
There we
open
go.
those settings.
Okay.
Sharing settings, and that does not work. I'm like, I can't do both at the same time.
That's all right. So the second link I just put in the chat then will take you to just our 2-pager that shows some of the results. And so as we took a look at the course and asked people that had taken it for 4 years prior, so had over 100 respondents that's had taken the course and did the survey, and they had told us that, you know, it has really positively influenced the way that they work with volunteers to build capacity in the extension program. So they did a wonderful job of describing the shift that they had in giving volunteers more responsibility to teach programs, engaging volunteers in dialogue and in program decisions, and empowering volunteers to lead major programs. And so again, when we see the impacts that volunteers have and the personal impacts to them as well as the public impact, it just makes sense that we would want to engage them more in teaching and making decisions and really leading programs. And staff I work with, I say, why would you want to take that away from volunteers, that opportunity for them to build those skills? So again, know that in September we will be releasing the registration for that online cohort course. It's national. So we've had colleagues from over 26 states that have taken that. We invite you to look into that or to share that with others. And again, I think if we have your contact information, we can directly email you that when it's available. But I know for Minnesota, both in 4-H youth development and other capacity areas, we have staff that take it every year, and it really has changed the way that they work and approach their work and expand their programs.
We have specifically made it non-4-H-y. It cuts, as Becky said, across the extension organization. We have wonderful facilitators that, for those of you that work in master gardeners or that area, gardening, we have great facilitators from Minnesota and Indiana and Wisconsin that have done a wonderful job of leading those groups. And this time around, they specifically put individuals with expertise in different areas, whether it's community or family, in specific groups, so they'd have even richer discussions in those areas.
All right, we're going to transition. There we go. I was going to do it without the slide, but we can do it with the slide. To a little bit, our last sort of reflection and sharing out, just to hear from you a little bit. Share with us, whether that's via the annotate feature on the screen or in the chat, one thing that you plan to try on in the next 3 months to better capture the public value of volunteers that you work with. So hearing some of the things we talked about today, applying those to where you specifically work, share with us one thing that you will be doing in the next 3 months. So again, you can use the annotate feature. If it's easier, you can type it in the chat pod. Give everybody a little bit of time. Maybe they're all busy trying to get into the Google Drive. See if they can pull those up.
No, I just don't have anything to write other than the generic survey. Like, I don't know how else to capture this.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a great place to start. Really to get some of those, that feedback and that information directly from those volunteers. One thing we always talk about is it's easier for the volunteers to tell that story. And so finding that avenue, that outlet to help them share that story. Anyone else have any things?
I think just as I think about that, and one of the pieces that we found was that volunteers often struggled to see how their work impacted the public value. They would say, well, I work with young people and young people do this or do. And so I think even just starting those informal conversations as we're in space with volunteers to get them thinking about how the work that they do impacts public value. And so maybe a bit priming the pump per se to be able to start to shift people's thinking around that.
And I'll just jump in and say that when we did our 4-H volunteer trainings that we do yearly here in North Dakota, I did the activity like we did with you, Candy and I, and some of us had talked about this. First of all, I presented the results that we found, and volunteers were just so surprised and so honored first to be up to know the impacts that they've made, or hear from, you know, that they'd taken the survey, and it's great to know that the results of that. So they were just so happy to hear that they were making these kind of impacts. But then in this group, we actually went through, like, we asked you to think about the individual, the organizational, and the community benefits that they'd personally had from volunteering. And they captured those, and I just put them on sheets of paper on a table, and they actually wrote on a Post-it note and then stuck their ideas about what they'd done on there. So that was a very informal way of gathering the same kind of information. So if you have some kind of training planned with your volunteers to be able to do something like that, we can even share those sheets too, or you can take those individual slides that we have in the PowerPoint and do that with your volunteers, how they have them think about how they've individually benefited, how they feel like they've contributed to extension, and then how they feel like they've made a difference in their community. And it'll be amazing. The Post-it notes that they wrote on and the ideas they shared made me cry, just like this research has as far as some of the cool things that have happened. So
yeah, there's a great similar example that's been shared in the chat pod, you know, using Facebook to start collecting some of those moments. I think really helps build the story, and you can start there. Yep, it doesn't have to be big, just start simple and go from that point on.
And we did
the next one.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. That's all.
You just recognizing time. We're at 10:55 here, Central Time Zone, 11:55 out there on the East Coast. We just wanted to get a quick sense of how you all are feeling. You know, just to give us some insight for you to share. So as a result of the presentation today, I better understand how to frame and implement strategies to capture the public value of volunteers. So again, using that annotate feature, stamp on that scale where you think, not really, most definitely, or maybe I already knew this information. So go ahead and take a second now to click on that view options up on top, annotate, find the stamp button, and drop it in there on that screen. And this is our last slide before we move into questions. So seeing a few responses pop in there. If you have any other feedback or things you would want to share with us, feel free to do that as well. As we move to the last slide, are there any questions that anybody has out there that we can help answer? We have about 4 minutes before our time is up. You know, we have our contact information there as well. You can contact any of us directly.
I'm going to just show these, and then I'm going to go allow people in if they aren't getting in. So these are the journal articles while you're doing questions.
Any questions or thoughts that people want to share?
I don't have any questions, but thank you for this opportunity to listen to your research, the bigger perspective on volunteer activities.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to join us while you're mobile. You know, we're all in different spaces at this point in time. You may hear my children. They've decided this is when they want to be loud and rowdy. So
We want to thank you for all the work that you're doing with volunteers out there across the country, and we are excited. Again, Candy, we shared those different, you'll have those email addresses if you're interested in the survey. We'd love to see this happen in other parts of Extension so we could really hear those results about what's going on in those other, because we know through our course and through other work that those volunteers in Extension are making a huge difference, and we need to continue to share those impacts that they're having.
Yeah, I would really like to see this survey, just because that's been my holdup, is everybody has survey fatigue. And then when you form a survey, you kind of have to send it out as a test, because when you get your results back, you realize you didn't ask the questions you meant to ask. So you got answers, but they weren't the answers you were looking for. And so I think that's been my biggest holdup.
Yeah.
So.
And we piloted this
Yep.
with a group of volunteers twice, several of us following up in different ways just to test and assess to make sure the questions resonated or made sense, because what might make sense to us might not make sense to somebody else taking it. So that was done several iterations of.
Well, I have reached my destination, so thank you guys. I'm going to hop off. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Great timing. Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
So yes, as we end up and wrap up, and really the public value has significant impact. And so we invite you to help contribute to the research that Extension has in making a difference in the lives and communities where people live, work, and play. And excited about the other sessions that'll be taking place at the conference. So thank you each for jumping on.
Thank you all very much.